Good morning. Welcome to my description, my example of how to do poetry analysis along with describing a poetry movement. Today we'll be looking at the beat poets of the 1950s. Maybe you did the beats, maybe you didn't. If you did the beats, this will be pretty helpful for you. If you didn't, no big deal. Please pay attention to the types of material I'm giving you in addition to um, like what I'm teaching about the beat poets. All right, so we've got the beat. Yeah. Brief overview of the beat poetry. All right. So let's start with a poem. And like I said, I do want all of you to give me a reading and an analysis of at least one poem. I'm just going to do one poem here also. So this is I Am 25 by Gregory Corso. The love, a madness for Shelley, Chatterton, Rimbaud, and the needy yap of my youth has gone from ear to ear. I hate old poet men, especially old poet men who retract, who consult other old poet men, who speak their youth in whispers, saying, I did those then, but that was then, that was then. Oh, I would quiet old men say to them, I am your friend, what you once were, through me you'll begin again. Then at night, in the confidence of their homes, rip out their apology tongues and steal their poems. So we're going to take a look at a couple of elements of this poem. The first thing we notice is sort of the style of it, right? And I think that's one of the things we want to notice, especially as we connect to the beats. Just on a sentence by sentence level, word by word level, this doesn't sound lyrical, right? This is not those classic tiger, tiger in the night, or tiger, tiger shining bright in the forest of the night. Like very sing-songy, lyrical sort of poem. This is not that, right? This feels almost like regular prose speech. And yet we can still tell that there's a sense of rhythm in here, right? Especially old poet men who retract to consult other old poet men who speak their youth in whispers, right? There's sort of like a syncopation to it. Then at night, in the confidence of their homes, rip out their apology tongues. So even though it does seem like it's not trying to be lyrical, there's still sort of like music rhythm to it all, right? So I think that's the first thing you want to notice. Like what type of writing is this? How is the writing done? And I think it's pretty clearly that pretty clearly not lyrical, but it is definitely still focused on rhythmic sounds and like how the words fit together, how they attend to one another. We'll see that again when I pull up an example from Ginsberg. What else do we see in here? And I think we can kind of check out a few different things. Let's go actually step by step. So are there confusing moments in this poem? We read it once. Feel free to read it again. But if we want to look at like the poetry protocol I gave you, are there confusing moments? Yeah, we might need to look up who Shelley, Chatterton, Rimbaud are. Sort of they're more classical writers like Shelley. And you could be referring either to Percy or Mary. My guess is probably Percy Shelley, the poet, as opposed to Mary Shelley, the novelist. Rimbaud is also a poet. So we're talking more about poetry here, right? These are classic French and English poets, very prolific and often well studied. So what we're going to see here then is sort of like a rebuke of that idea, right? I hate the old poet men. I like, there's this sort of complicated relationship to who these people are, right? So, but if you don't know who they are, that's probably the first thing to look up. The focal point of the poem obviously comes in this I hate old poet men. I'd probably highlight that as a important, interesting, difficult passage, right? Especially old poet men who retract to consult other old poet men who speak their youth in whispers, saying, I did those then, but that was then, that was then. Right. There's maybe like a little bit of confusion here in the narrative, right? Like, what's he trying to say? Is this in adoration of? Is this in love of poetry, of old poetry, or is this in hatred of it, right? It seems like maybe a little bit of both. So there's probably a few moments in there we could probably highlight as kind of confusing, right? I think I would quiet old men say to them. I'm not exactly sure. Like that's kind of a difficult sentence to parse out in terms of its syntax, right? So there's a few of those moments, right? Start making outside connections. And again, if we've done the definitions, we can say like this is looking at classic poetry, old poet men. Again, this is sort of like a classic beat style. Um, I don't like authority. I don't like what's classic, right? So we'll see that a little bit more when we start talking about the major characteristics of the movement. But then there's also sort of this interesting turn here, right? And a lot of poems have a turn, or what the Italians would call a volta. We see it kind of, I think, about 2/3 of the way down here. Oh, I would quiet old men say to them, right? Almost like comfort, almost like the old poetry and all these things that were, right? I'm doing them too, right? I am your friend. What you once were, through me, you'll be again. It's a very positive, sort of uplifting message to, um, like the has-beens of the world. But it ends on this much more acerbic note. Then at night, in the confidence of their homes, rip out their apology tongues and steal their poems. Right? It's an interesting idea about like where this genesis of writing comes from. I think it's that's sort of where we see this poem. What's the one sentence takeaway? For me, I think I come back to the idea that at the end of this poem, we're looking at what the nature of inspiration is, right? That no matter how talented you are, you can still steal from people, right? That poetic inspiration is often somewhat imitative. So one sentence, poetic inspiration is often imitative. There we go. All right, let's talk a little about the major characteristics of the beat movement, right? And we'll kind of relate these back to the poem as we move forward. Beats, in the words of the Poetry Foundation website, are poets who rebelled against the conventions of mainstream American life and writing. They became known as the beat poets, a name that evokes weariness, down and outness, the beat under a piece of music, and beatific spirituality. All those things don't really seem to quite go together, right? Beatific spirituality along with down and outness, right? A musical quality that still like ignores lyrical poetry, right? There's a little bit of contradiction to this, but I think this is actually pretty true. This is much like Romantics, and we'll make the connection again, the Romantics to the Beats. We're looking at a time frame in America where everything's really prosperous, and so this is sort of like looking for meaning and beauty in a world that is increasingly materialistic, right? So they, in rejection of materialism, and in some ways in rejection of American society in the 1950s, they're also looking for something that's maybe like a little bit outside the realm of what would be normal inside of American ideology in the 1950s. They were both iconoclasts and romantics, but not unaware of older forms of writing. But rather than reference Shakespeare mythology, they mythologized their current world. This isn't so much clear in the poem that I just did because they're talking about Shelley and Rimbaud. But in terms of a lot of beat poetry, they use like this mythological sort of language around things like biker gangs, bars, like modern to the 50s, modern moments in time, right? So mythologized language, even though it's really not using mythology much, not making those classical references. Although it is worth pointing out that they probably were educated enough to know what those were. Anyways, they were all about the moment, very much here for a good time, not a long time types of people. Yeah, some of the most enduring parts of the movement would be like Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road, which is sort of all about just like wild, crazy times, living in the moment, not getting stuck thinking about the future, right? So this is not my advocation of that. I'm not advocating that position. But that's what they were, right? That's sort of one of the enduring legacies of the beat movement is that they have that sort of romantic but American romantic sense of like living for the moment, living in the moment, that kind of thing, which is appealing, right? Appealing if maybe not always prudent. Allen Ginsberg stated their attitude as first thought, best thought, which wasn't exactly original to them, but a big part of the ethos. Yeah, and again, I think that's probably just about spot on. Allen Ginsberg is probably the most famous poet of the beat movement. His most famous poem is Howl. I'm not recommending that you read it. It's got a lot of material in it that, at least for school, would probably be a little bit controversial. So this is certainly not me assigning that material, even though it is a fairly prominent piece of poetry. but like this idea, the first thought, best thought. It's really, I mean, it's kind of impressionistic. It's like, you know, the French impressionist painters like go out, write, paint what you're seeing right now, right? The Romantics go out, live in the moment, write what you're feeling right now. You know, that's not the first time that this idea came around, right? So when we think about like what defines this movement, we don't necessarily need to think like they're innovating the whole thing, but maybe like readapting different you know, like the same, actually, sorry, readapting the same ideologies to new contexts, right? So the Romantics of the British era, the early 1800s, you had very much the same idea, but they're dealing with the British Industrial Revolution as opposed to post-war America. So like these are completely different contexts, right? So that's probably where we see the most difference, not just in the ideology, but in the context. Style was free form, but also heavily influenced by jazz and contemporary music. There is often a syncopation in a musical style that's felt and heard in reading the poems, but difficult to name, categorize, and we saw that also, right? So like, if we want to get really technical, can we point out like where the iambs and the trochees in this? Yeah, but they're not consistent, right? So we're not looking at iambic pentameter here. We're not looking at classical hexameter. We're looking at free form poetry that still takes a musical sense to it, right? So it's not prose. It's still poetry. It's not lyrical though. Cool. The when and the where. So this is largely post World War II, right? In fact, you know, exclusively World War II. This is just before what we would call postmodernism, which mostly begins in the early mid 60s. This is just after people came from World War II, right? So we typically think of the beats as from the 1950s, but really the movement started in the 40s. And even before that, I would say it kind of has its roots with people like William Carlos Williams and Imagist poetry. William Carlos Williams was a famous poet. You actually may have probably read some of his poetry in grade school, which is kind of funny when you consider him as a person. You don't really think of him as someone who would be like writing for children. But if you're familiar with the red wheelbarrow, so much depends upon the red wheelbarrow, right? It's a very classic poem read to grade school kids. But that type of Imagist poetry, go out, see a thing, write about the thing, it was really inspirational with Ginsberg, and they're actually mentors and friends. So in that way, you know, like post World War II, but it's got some artistic references that are beyond the war. That down and outness, though, right? That downtrodden sort of ethos, that feeling, that mentality, you know, like that's definitely a part of the post World War II thing, right? Like one of the poems I was reading as I was doing this, and I don't remember which one off the top of my head. You know, like it's very harsh, like screw the war, screw the industrial complex, I hate blah blah blah. We're like anger at the H-bomb and all the, you know, all the stuff that came out of the war, right? And that's sort of like we see like the early movement of postmodernism in there too, where people are kind of horrified by what humanity is capable of as a result of World War II, right? Not just genocide, but then also the propensity from our technology to not just be our savior, but also our doom. And that's a Frozen quote, if you're paying close attention. Despite being at a university, the movement mostly started in New York, specifically at NYU with Ginsberg and friends. A little bit in the West Village also, but for the most part, NYU is the big part. Neither Ginsberg nor his friends graduated from NYU. They started off there, but they were not the academic types, despite being pretty intelligent people. Also, despite being at a university, the style and popularity were very much outside the halls of academia. Right? These are not like professor poets. These are like live for the moment poets. Very different sort of mentality, and a lot of working class roots. We see like most of the beat poets are not, you know, as is frequently the tradition in American classic literature and poetry. They're not really like the waspy type of people, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. These are Ginsberg is Jewish. There's a lot of Italian writers. So you know, like it's a little bit more diverse in the voices than a lot of American poetry had been up to that point. Along with the success of the beat movement, there were problems. Drug use was prevalent, and the sexually liberated ethos of the movement was often met with pushback from more traditional parts of the literary world. Yeah, I mean, like that's totally true, right? Like if we like William S. Burroughs was like an out gay man in the 50s that just doesn't really like lend itself to a lot of acceptance in a lot of circles. Especially when he's certainly not alone in that identity. Um, yeah, so like this was definitely one of those movements that like in certain circles is very popular. The live for the moment, live romantically sort of thing is really popular. But at the same time, right, it's always worth pointing out that like there were legitimate problems also in this. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about like the nature of tragedy and beauty. I think there's actually just a few more slides. There's also a sense of tragedy and beauty to the whole thing, right? Much like the Romantics, from whom many of the beats took inspiration, there's a sense of tragedy and brilliance set against a problematic time for these writers, right? So if you're William S. Burroughs, sort of like he had AIDS also, so like he's a talented, well loved. He actually is kind of like a science fiction writer also, in addition to a poet. But also like not going to work out. Like life is not going to work out for this guy. It's going to be tough. It's going to be hard. It's going to be rough. And I think that's true of Ginsberg and of Kerouac and a lot of, like at one point, there's like a Ginsberg helps Kerouac get rid of a body of a guy who tried to fight him in a bar, and they end up stabbing each other. It's like so there's like a lot of drama here, a lot of problems. And so we see like the really dramatic biography of all these people as sort of like a tragedy of a brilliant mind in a rough situation, if that makes sense, right? Okay, like I think one of the things that most clearly demonstrates is the opening lines to Howl. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves to the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night. Ooh, right, that's pretty heavy stuff. That's not exactly, uplifting. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, right? So this is one of those like social conditions for a lot of people that Ginsberg knows are such that they're never really going to be happy and successful in the way that he'd like. So we get that tragedy and beauty at the same time, sort of thing. Also, I want to point out this last line: "Angel-headed hipsters burning in the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo." That is right. Is it lyrical? Is it following a lyrical pattern? Is it sing-songy? No. Does it clearly have a sense of how it's supposed to sound and how it's supposed to syncopate? Yes. Right. So to come back to our sense of how this is written. Just like the Romantics rebelling against the growth of England under the Industrial Revolution, the beats were countercultural to the 50s. We already kind of mentioned this, but it's worth going over again. It was a prosperous time for Americans who fit in, but the enduring legacy of the beats largely deals with the nature of not fitting in. I think that's probably true. And we'll continue that right here. We see their legacy living on in new countercultural movements. The impulse to defy authority and expectation comes both before and after the beat movement. So they're not the first people to do it, right? But it's a continuation of them, to the context of the 50s. Mostly the 50s. It is often said that hippies and today hipsters came from the beat generation, right? Which, if we look back, angel-headed hipsters, right? Hippies, right? There's a lot of common language in there, and I think I'm using the etymological resources of the internet here to bring this to you. Dictionary.com agrees with me, right? That there's sort of an etymological pattern to the word hipster, which we still use today, right? To categorize people that are somewhat countercultural, trying to like move against the grain, more interested in things like experience, the materials, or material wealth, right? It's the ongoing legacy of the beat generation, which existed before them and continues on after. I also say like it's a type of writing that was popular and prevalent enough to spawn jokes and movies about it decades later, which is kind of fun, right? I don't know if any of you watched the TV show Archer. I'm certainly not putting a plug in here for it, but he references Howl at least a couple times in that movie, in that show. Like, which is a silly example, but it shows you how ubiquitous that story is, that poem is, that it can be used as a joke, right? If a lot of people don't recognize that poem, then the joke fails. So in that sense, it kind of speaks to the popularity of the Beat movement. There's also two different biopics that I know of about Allen Ginsberg, both of which involve fairly major actors. The first one was James Franco as Allen Ginsberg, and that movie is called Howl. The second one, the name of which escapes me at the moment, featured Daniel Radcliffe as Allen Ginsberg. So like they're fairly prominent, right? And it's not exactly A-listers, but still, enough popularity, enough people know them, care about them, that they'd be interested in the biopic. And I would say like there's constant reprintings of major works on a continuous basis. So like if you wanted to go buy a book of beat poetry today, you're not going to ever find it out of print. It's still super available. Cool. And that's my example. So that's all you got to do. And let me know if you are able to get this done on your own. Due date's probably going to be Friday. If I can get the technology to work, we'll be in contact on that. All right, great. Thanks.